Sometimes my connection. Oh, there we go. Everyone say hello.
Hi.
Thank you. Welcome, 10 o'clock class, to the 11:37, 15-minute lecture of Chapter 3. We'll see if that even works. Okay, so like I said before, we're really just introducing some of the things about the cell. This is the very same thing you've done in lab. Cell theory, what is that? Anybody remember that from 5th grade? The cell is the basic unit of life. When the term was created, I don't know, I always forget. It was either Robert Hooke or Anton van Leeuwen, whatever his name was. He saw this and thought that these looked like little jail cells when he looked at the first image through the microscope. So we call it the cell. We have three main parts: plasma membrane, which is also called the cell membrane, right? The cytoplasm and nucleus. So know those three parts. And basically what we're looking at is just a big donut, if we think of it in that terms. Not all cells are round. We'll get into all kinds of shapes of cells in the next chapter. But certainly as a start-off example, think of a donut, right? We got the cell membrane on the outside, the nucleus on the inside being the jelly, let's say, the brain of the donut. And then in between would be what? The cytoplasm, right? So the cytoplasm has several names, as does the cell membrane. We can call it cytoplasm, we can call it cytosol. We can also call it the intracellular environment, right? Because it's within the cell or within the cell membrane. We can look at the cell membrane and give it several names. It's also called the plasma membrane. It's also called the Phospholipid Bilayer, right? It's also called referred to as the fluid mosaic model. What is a mosaic?
Little pieces.
Pieces of a bunch of things put together, right? So when we look at the entire cell membrane, with all the proteins and carbohydrates coming off of it, you know, it looks like a little mosaic of something. So that's what they call it, mosaic. And it's fluid because it constantly is in fluid motion. So it's not so static of an environment where the cells are so rigid on the outside. It's very, very fluid. So when they bump up to one another, they kind of bend as they need to. Inside the cytoplasm, we'll talk about all the organelles, which is what you did in lab. Things like the mitochondria, the lysosomes, the ER, all that stuff, ribosomes. Those are all organelles. Just like we in our body have organs, the body of the cell has its own organs, right, being called organelles. So, for example, what did the mitochondria do? Kind of like the powerhouse, the energy production. What about lysosome? Kind of like a digestive system, right? Perfect. So we'll go all through those. This chapter is really not that bad. The toughest part is just getting the specifics of the membrane physiology down, the transport mechanisms that we also did in lab. So that is specific, but the rest of this chapter, the only difficult part is really at the end when we talk about the events of protein synthesis. We get into the RNA and how we make a temporary copy of DNA. We scan that temporary copy in order to make a protein. So that's pretty specific there at the end. Everything throughout the middle is stuff you probably had before in a science class somewhere. Okay. So here's our general trend of organization. Hopefully. Like it has time to catch up. You gotta love Wi-Fi, right? The world at your fingertips. If the Wi-Fi is working. It's a very interesting, ironic paradox to our technology. Okay, so where are we on this? We finished with chemistry, right? You did it. Now we're into the cell level because we know that chemistry makes up the cells. These organic compounds that we studied, the proteins, the carbs, the lipids, the nucleic acids, that's what gives the structure to the cell. If we don't have those organic compounds, we don't have a cell. If we don't have the inorganic compounds, things like sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, all these other ions and such, then it doesn't work right. So if you can think of the organic world as being the structure, right, the actual physical structure of the cell, you can think of the inorganic world as the software, what helps the cell run properly. So you need both. So a good nod of respect to that chemistry chapter. It's more important than you think. We refer to it quite a bit, even in AMP2. But there we go. You know the rest of the story there. The basic unit of life, this functional unit of life, is our cell. Everything that the cell does, all the sum of events, is what we'll call metabolism. So everything that we talk about that goes on inside the cell, which the first order of business for any cell, and I want you to know this really, really quickly, before we get involved in all those functions of the organelles, you have to know that the number one thing a cell wants to do every day, besides protect itself, because that's always in the background with the lymphatics, but protein synthesis. If you've seen already how proteins are everywhere, right? Not just meat, like in muscle. Proteins make up the structure of everything. From the smallest little microfilament to the larger proteins, the plasma proteins and the gamma globulins and the blood and everything, they're all proteins. All your enzymes, right? Proteins are where it's at. So lots of activities, but the number one would be protein synthesis. Why is this not working for me? That really upsets me. Okay, so again, there's our three main parts. By the way, who wants to miss that question? The three main parts of the cell. Lots of parts of the cell, but do you know the three main ones? Right? Plasma membrane, cytoplasm, and nucleus. Also know the other names, like we said. Cytosol for cytoplasm, intracellular environment for cytoplasm, and then all the names for the cell membrane, which is what we're going to get into right now. Here's why we call it a fluid mosaic. Look at all the things involved. These are proteins, right? What structure or organization would they be since they're rounded? Are they primary, secondary, or tertiary? Tertiary, which would be globular, yes. What about these? What about these protein filaments inside the cell membrane? Little wavy lines, primary, right? So we see proteins everywhere. It just so happens that those little red filaments you see in the inside of the cell membrane, these are what we call cytoskeletal filaments. What does a skeleton do for your body?
Structural support.
It gives you a framework, yeah. Definitely storage, but in this case, the structure is what we're talking about. So these red filaments, so to speak, will define the shape of the cell. So when I say cytoskeleton, cyto refers to cell, and skeleton refers to the infrastructure, the shape of it. So those little filaments right there maintain the shape and the integrity of the cell. If you don't have protein synthesis and those cytoskeletal filaments are not present, or if they're deformed, what happens to the cell? It's very vulnerable and it could die, right? Which is what happens in a lot of diseases. One of the main things that viruses do to our body, which is why they attack us so hard, viruses, what do? They attack our cell's ability for protein synthesis. So straight up, we automatically feel like crap, don't we? Until our body can find a way to overcome the virus's effect. We never really kill viruses. We just kind of deactivate them or keep them busy doing other things. Once you have a virus, it really sticks with you. I mean, you could be dead and dust, right? Thousands of years from now. Your body in the coffin, right? There may be some teeth left and some hair, but guess what lives the longest of anything in this world? Viruses, right? Yes, they've found viruses on, meteorites and such, traveling through the universe, and they're still alive. But they're dormant. They always need a host. So they can't do anything unless they have a living organism to get into and screw with the protein synthesis. Viruses are crazy, man.
What do you mean viruses? Like diseases?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. An actual pathogen, a virus.
That's cool.
Right. And that's why it so goes with the whole computer thing. Viruses spread from computer to computer, and they get in and when you open up a program, they could sit there, right? Not cause a problem in your computer, but what happens when you open up a program? Then they start replicating itself all over, right? And you get all these stupid pop-up ads and all kind of crap like that. Yep, okay. So fluid mosaic because we have lots of things to talk about. We have membrane proteins embedded in the cell membrane here. We've got what we call a glycocalyx, which is this antenna system on the outside of the cell. That's how cells communicate with each other, just like antennas. It helps cells recognize other friendly cells, or it helps our immune system as they're swimming by. They can look at our antenna system and say, hey, that's not a normal cell. Let's go attack it. So that also is important. We'll get into that glycocalyx.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
That's protein and lipids, which is the main part, main component.
The main component?
Uh-huh.
The
Cell membrane.
glycoproteins.
Glycoprotein.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for the cell membrane itself, we know from lab, it's phospholipids primarily. That's what makes up the lipid bilayer. It's 2 layers of phospholipids. That's why we call it a bilayer. It's set up such that the nonpolar tails will be next to each other, making up the thickness of the cell membrane. Right? And the polar heads, these are phosphate heads, as we learned in lab. The nonpolar tails, what are those? Fatty acids. So the full name would be a polar phosphate head and nonpolar fatty acid tails. That's how you really should know it. And that'll likely be something you get quizzed on in lab. The fatty acid tails, which are nonpolar, which means what as far as the charge goes? No charge, right? Which means it is hydrophobic. We refer to the heads, which are polar, which means they have a separation of charges, right? Which would be hydrophilic. Okay, other parts of the cell membrane, cholesterol gives it strength. So we definitely need cholesterol in our diet somewhere, just at a controlled level. And then glycolipids. What does the glyco refer to, by the way? Sugar. So this is largely a lipid, but with some sugars attached to it. So we call it a glycolipid. We have certain embedded dispersed proteins, which we saw, which could be those channel proteins we learned in lab. They come in these 3 kinds: integral, peripheral, and glycocalyx. An integral protein, you remember that model you saw in lab with the red straws and the white balls? Then we had that blue thing floating in the middle. Notice how the blue thing spanned the entire width of the cell membrane. It was integrated in the cell membrane. That's an integral protein. Something that spans any part of the width or the thickness of the cell membrane is an integral protein. Something that's only found on the outer surface or the inner surface, like a button on the outside or the inside of the cell membrane, is a peripheral. And the glycocalyx, like we said, very elaborate picture of those. And we'll see another picture, I think, coming up. So look at all that. Oh my God. Who wants to memorize all that? You don't have to. I'm just wanting you to know, give full respect to that glycocalyx, because this is some of the things that it does. Not that I'm asking you to memorize all of what these do, but just know that we need this elaborate structure, this signature, what they call it, a cell signature on the outside of our cells, mainly for protection, right? Just know that at least, for protection. Okay. So here's another slide of the cell membrane one more time, and then we're just about to finish up. What are these blue filaments again on the inside? Cytoskeletal filaments. Are they proteins? Yes, right? Is this a protein? Yes. Is that a protein? Yes. These are integral because they're embedded in. What about this one? Peripheral. There you go. Perfect. And everything up top, the green antenna structure, would be part of our glycocalyx for cell recognition and protection. Okay, guys, we'll pick it up Friday. Have a great day.